If you want the album that defines Queen's unique, fabulous pomp rock sound, you listen to Queen 2. You could go to Sheer Heart Attack for a listen at their ultimate glam rock foundations, even though that's the album that arrived after Queen 2. It's Queen 2 which prophesizes the heaviness which would become this band's staple and popular appeal over the course of Night at the Opera, Day at the Races, and especially News of the World. The first Queen album, the self-titled, released in 1973, is a fairly clean and straightforward, though not bad by any means, perfectly decent mainstream hard rock album. Actually, it's a fairly hard rockin' album for 1973. It has a glam tinge to it, but it's more of just it's like surprisingly good, clean, ahead of its time hard rock production. It sounds like something that you'd hear from the later 70s perhaps, but with a certain early 70s glam production polish, even though the music I wouldn't necessarily call glam rock. Although, here's the thing, I would say Queen 2 has more suggestions of glam rock in its composition, and Sheer Heart Attack just went outright compared to the first album. If there's any glam rock on A Night at the Opera and Day at the Races, it's evolved into this sort of strange art rocky music hall, mutant Paul McCartney, uber eccentric, leisure class, delightful twiddle, which we can see as a sort of cousin or nephew of glam rock of sorts, perhaps. Or related to it, of course, quite obviously, you know. What we have in Queen 2 is a kind of medieval sorceress gothic glam, which I find really fascinating. And it's a heavy rock album of 1974. It's trying to compete with some of the Led Zeppelin heaviness of the Four Houses of the Holy era, but it's also trying to have a unique flavour of its own. A sort of operatic, heavy, kind of involving production. Roy Thomas Baker's production here is phenomenally ahead of its time. Even Frank Zappa singled Queen albums out for their production merits, stating that he couldn't believe some of the things that Queen albums are doing, especially given that they were not using synthesizers. Queen 2 is the base of the Queen sound, which was expanded upon in a more fanciful novelty music hall direction on the likes of Night at the Opera and A Day at the Races. A more mainstream, modern hard rock sound, less fantasy musings, and more a kind of contemporary urban or suburban poetry, if you may, on News of the World, to the kind of even more contemporary, kind of pristine, you know, world of glamour and glitz pop, mainstream of jazz and the game. They attempted this again on Hot Space, of course, and then 80s Queen is very mainstream, very poppy, very sentimental, very ballad heavy. I'm not the biggest fan. I actually really love Hot Space. I know that's an odd opinion, but I thought that worked for what it was extremely well. More so than Jazz in the Game. I'm not the biggest fan of those two. In the Works, Kind of Magic, The Miracle. Innuendo I like a lot, but that was a return to the 70s sound. But see, yeah, the sound you get on Innuendo, which is kind of Queen going back to themselves in a lot of fans' ears, that's more reminiscent of the sound of Queen 2 than anything else. So Queen 2 is the source of everything unique, distinct, and special about Queen in the hardcore fan's eyes, in the OG fan, someone who appreciates Queen from the get-go. A vivid, evocative, and extremely memorable album, and yet sometimes I wonder, why do I listen to Queen 2? Why do I revere it in a manner that's similar to the likes of the great Led Zeppelin albums, the great Pink Floyd albums, the great Who albums, the great rock albums around it, the great David Bowie albums? Because other people don't seem to place Queen 2 or just Queen albums in general this high. Maybe Night at the Opera, maybe, but Queen 2 seems to get very underrated in the world of, I don't know, deciding what the great rock album canon is, that world of and recorded music curation. I think Queen 2 is a major classic. So if we're going to consider Queen a major classic band, I think Queen 2 is the album where it's the masterpiece of it's them inducting themselves into the canon of unique, distinct, influential rock sounds. I think if this was Queen's debut album, it would have a reputation more similar to Led Zeppelin's first album, Pink Floyd's Piper at the Gates of Dawn. These albums where a band is really coming into its own and it's just like, oh wow, boom, here it is. Maybe The Who, a quick one. I would say so, but I know some might suggest that The Who's debut is that. I'm less of a fan of that. I'm more into a quick one onwards. So people see or hear Queen 2 as the second album and they just think, oh yeah, they were still finding their sound. But there's a certain cognitive dissonance. Imagine there's no Queen 1. There's plenty of people who love Queen 1 and have no problems with Queen 2 either. And they'll happily revere those albums as classic. Hardcore Queen fans will. That's fine. We're not talking about them for now. Those individuals, hypothetical or otherwise for now. We're talking about those who would consider Queen 2 to be nothing special, perhaps. I would implore you, consider if Queen 2 was Queen's debut album. You would think, oh my god, this band right out of nowhere is coming up with this fabulous sound. Holy hell. You wouldn't think of it as Queen in between. You would think of it as Queen evolving and becoming itself in one album. And that's how I feel about Queen 2. And most importantly, I feel as though the resultant imaginative explosion that was Queen discovering that sound results in a phenomenally interesting track list of glorious production from Roy Thomas Baker and some of the most evocative and interesting rock sounds of the 1970s, in my opinion, to my ears at least. I'm going to try and make a case now for why Queen 2 belongs amongst the canon of the great rock albums of the 1970s or otherwise. Let's go through this delightful, memorable, unforgettable, ripping, and stirring, mesmerizing track list. Procession, the opening track, is a 1.5-minute brooding sort of build-up introduction moment. Its thumping, that kind of gradual heartbeat-esque thump reminds one a little of The Dark Side of the Moon. Maybe it's an attempt to homage/parody it. Then rather than bring in the kind of bells and whistles, it's may bring in this kind of regal guitar tone. Interesting stuff. Leading into Father to Son is a pretty good track. Heavy for 1974, certainly. Then we go into White Queen. This track is amazing. Just listening to it, letting it play out, imagining it. If one had heard the song White Queen on the radio, they would think, this is a beautiful song. It just, given the possibilities of general songwriting, White Queen occupies those spaces in a really lovely and inspired manner, I think. Someday One Day is beautiful and underrated. Then the Roger Taylor sung, the loser in the end is good, solid glam rock. Going on to side 2, Ogre Battle is genius. This is one of the top Queen tracks of all time, to be absolutely sure. Fairy Fella's Masterstroke is great. You can't go wrong with that. Soldier, sailor, tinker, tailor, fly by. Wonderful. Nevermore is great. What a wonderful 1.5-minute track. Just takes you by surprise, captivates you, strings you along, and then once it finishes, you're a little bit disappointed. You almost wish it went longer. The March of the Black Queen is astonishingly great. This is more or less, I was going to say the greatest Queen song of all time. I'm partial to tracks like Don't Stop Me Now. I think that's just one of the great singles of all time in any decade. But The March of the Black Queen is one of the most impressive compositions Queen ever recorded. Top 5 or 3 in my view, my ears. Then you have Funny How Love Is, which is repetitive, but also pretty fun. It could have been shorter though. It closes with 7 Seas of Rhye. Amazing. A phenomenal deep Queen highlight. One of the finest tracks on this album, and one of the finest tracks they put out during the 1970s. Absolutely. It's an amazing, unique track list. Queen without any recognizable hit singles or overplayed staples of our media. It is true, however, the album somewhat lacks a big banger other than The March of the Black Queen. There is Ogre Battle also, although take for example, the 6-minute Father to Son doesn't stand out individually as a song, just as some sonics. White Queen is lovely, but too soft to be truly memorable for me, like as a off the top of my head memorable song. I can appreciate it in the moment, but I can't remember it because it's so ballady, White Queen. As pretty as it is in the moment, as much as it engages me in the moment, I don't remember it when it's not playing in the same way, how it goes precisely. Someday One Day is nice, but it isn't world-changing necessarily. Loser in the End is hardly a major classic of Queen or anyone else. I like it though. Ogre Battle, as I said, yes, a genius song. That's the banger standout track. But Fairy Fellow is that's novelty genius, though it may be. It's still novelty. Nevermore is really short, and then March of Black Queen, of course, is the major classic. Funny how Love is not highly memorable as a track. The only reason I remember the song, how it goes, is because I've listened to this album so many times and it just sticks out as a bit repetitive. And then Seven Seas of Rhye, yeah, that's also a genius work of Queen's. Maybe 3/4 tracks on here which are truly stand out. But, well, let me put it like this. So 3 tracks, maybe, or 4, compared to every track on Dark Side of the Moon, even Money to an extent. Every track almost on Led Zeppelin 4, certainly Houses of the Holy, some of the best Beatles or David Bowie albums, or maybe even not as consistently memorable a listen as A Day at the Races or News of the World as far as Queen's discography goes. I'm listening to it now and I'm feeling why I'm not about to put it on the same tier exactly as some of the other albums I'm comparing it to, and I had at the start of this video, artist albums of the 1970s rock era. But damn, is it close, or so close that it may as well be on the same shelf, honestly. Queen 2 represents as I said, a foundation of Queen's sound without any of the recognisable, iconic and overplayed, frankly, hit singles that bore everyone to death and make one look like a bit of a square. Want to hear Queen as a cool, exciting new rock band, fresh 1975? Hey, you thought Led Zeppelin were cool, you thought Pink Floyd were cool, you thought The Who were cool, you thought David Bowie was cool. Well, listen to this new band I just heard, Queen. Oh man, you'll love this. I can't wait to hear where they're going. Well, that's the album. And you know what? I'd include it in part of my personal great rock album canon. It's just so much fun to listen to. I love returning to it. Such an absorbing soundscape here.